It's now my great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, the Honourable Julian Hill MP, who is the Member for Parliament for Bruce and the Assistant Minister for Citizenship, Customs and Multicultural Affairs and the Assistant Minister for International Education. Julian, thank you very much for taking time, especially during this busy sitting week, and the podium is yours.
Thank you for the invitation to be here, Alan, and to the ANU leadership team. It is a sitting day, so I need to be back at the house by 12 because the whip is a scary person. I wrote a speech, which I don't always do. I was actually planning just to turn up and have a chat with a few dot points, but that struck terror into the heart of various other ministers' offices in this particular sitting week, so I wrote a speech on the plane on Sunday. So here we go. But I'm happy to take a few questions if time permits. Look, I'm really always happy to come and talk about migration. It represents about 80% of the work or thereabouts of my electorate office in southeast Melbourne. Berkey's not here, so I'll say the most multicultural council area in the country, a little bit contested with Western Sydney, in the city of Greater Dandenong drifting into the city of Casey. For our multicultural and globally connected communities, a properly designed and properly resourced and functioning migration system is critical infrastructure. It's core to daily life, how you keep in contact with loved ones, how you facilitate business and trade, for family emergencies and so on, let alone the trauma of the humanitarian program. It's as important to people I represent as other government services, Medicare, NDIS and so on. I also engaged with migration actually through my former public service career in the Victorian government, where for a time I looked after Victoria's skilled and business migration programs and supported international education. Before that, one of my favourite ever jobs was actually running metropolitan strategy in the Victorian government as a public servant, working on both sides of politics, looking after the long-term planning of Melbourne, leading metropolitan strategy urban development. Now, there are close parallels between a state planning system and the Commonwealth migration system. Both are always contested, weaving together economic, social and environmental outcomes. Both involve decisions which impact directly infrastructure and housing. Everyone's an armchair expert. There are also armchair experts I learned before that when I was mayor of a big council on traffic. Everyone is a local traffic expert. Everyone's got a view on planning and everyone's got a view on migration. Every government department knocks on your door asking you to solve their policy problem. Now, in the state domain, the answer was always a new planning zone or an overlay. If only we could complexify the planning system a little more, then this department's problem would be solved. And I've emoted with Mike Willard that the same thing happens in migration. Everyone's knocking on the door wanting a new visa class or a change to the rule. Both are highly complex regulatory systems with devolved decision-making, dynamic case law, tribunals and panels. If you think you're having a bad day out in migration, just remember you don't have elected councils, so something to be grateful for. There's a whole web of intermediaries, agents, tribunals, panels, lawyers, consultants, developers, and plenty of academics, including many here, ready to critique you. And of course, both of those regimes actually in the state and the Commonwealth sphere have minister as God powers to actually deal with the unforeseen circumstances and make the whole system work. Try as we might, we've never found a way to run either system without the minister having the magic wand for various things. Migration is endlessly complex and fascinating, both in policy and political terms. Now, Matt might have mentioned this morning, I think he was here this morning, 2025 is a year of significant anniversaries. The 80th anniversary of the Immigration Department, and it's been one of the lovely things moving around the country, actually engaging with staff, some of whom have family lineage with the Migration Department over those decades. The 50th anniversary of the Whitlam Labor government's introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act, which I don't think got the public attention it perhaps warranted because it was their last piece of legislation declared, so the focus was on the dismissal. The 50th anniversary of the advent of large-scale Vietnamese migration to our country. And this year we established the Office for Multicultural Affairs, and I acknowledge Sneha Chatterjee, who is the first director or first assistant secretary of the Office for Multicultural Affairs. We'll soon welcome our 1 millionth humanitarian migrant since World War II, which is a pretty cool milestone for our country to reflect on. So I won't dwell at length on the fact, and I say fact, we're a migrant nation. That's self-evident to the people in this room. It's a source of national strength and pride, and a fact. contested as it may be in some of the alternate realities which we're seeing at the moment. Every town, every region, every suburb, every community, every workplace, every sporting club has been touched now by generations of migrants. There are relatives, neighbours, friends, work colleagues, business leaders, small business owners, researchers, and more. With the exception of the First Peoples, of course, everyone has a migrant heritage story, and I also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of this part of Australia. It's also a fact that Australia's always been a multicultural continent. First Nations Australians spoke more than 250 languages, many of which are still in use today, intermingled for centuries to the peoples to our north, in the lands now known as Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Timor-Leste and so on, the Pacific Islands, then British settlement, and now the modern, diverse, multicultural Australia that we know today. Modern Australia and multicultural Australia are the same thing. In essence, they're synonyms. Now, I make those points up front because despite genuinely held and legitimate concerns by some fair-minded Australians, our discussion of migration now has become particularly toxic in this climate of nasty politics, making rational policy debate, which is never easy in this space, harder than it should be. Now, some of this reflects global trends and pressures, the rise of the populist right, the spread of misinformation and disinformation and the movement of people at scale, whether through forced displacement or economic migrants, whatever the preferred lingo is, people in search of a better life. We've seen the mass migration in Europe and the rolling situation on the southern US border, for instance. Now, all of those things globally spill over in our modern and digitally connected world to influence our debates and our politics, despite the fact that Australia does not have or suffer from mass migration. Australia has a highly orderly, controlled border and flow of people. In fact, our border is a national asset, which we manage for our benefit. Now, there's a dichotomous tension in how the border is managed, which is pretty simple and long-standing. Indeed, the Customs, which I'm Assistant Minister for Customs as well, is one of the oldest functions in the Commonwealth Government. At its heart, it's simple: to get the good stuff in as efficiently as possible and keep the stuff you don't want and the people you don't want as far away from the border as possible. The basic principle has shaped borders for centuries, and it still underpins how we think about movement and security today. But while there are international forces, we can't ignore that some of the toxic politics and division that we see today has domestic roots, both long-standing as well as current. Our tensions over migration have ebbed and flowed for generations of post-British settlement. It's driven by a reflex that goes right back to European settlement to blame migrants when things go wrong, especially the ones who've just arrived. Whether it's unemployment, wages, pressures on services, infrastructure, housing, whatever the issue of the day may be, these debates are not new. They go in cycles. Years ago, I read Still Lucky, which was a book by eminent social researcher and a very old friend of mine, Rebecca Huntley. I actually called her in the car on the way here and read this paragraph and said, "I'm not misremembering this, I'm not verbling." She said, "No, you got it." So that's good. Reflecting on years of her social research, she observed in a very powerful chapter in that book on race that it was an unattractive reality of Australian society for centuries now that the last groups of people in the door tend to cop it the worst before everyone kind of gets used to them. In part, though, the particularly toxic present debate is being exacerbated by our nation's so-called mainstream conservative parties choosing to try and leverage issues of race and migration. That's a choice. Whether to generate anger, trade on the ancient human instinct to fear people who are different, or to foster division in the belief of some short-term partisan gain. Now, the Conservatives, of course, would argue this. I think there's a long body of evidence, are past masters at using fear, and particularly fear of outsiders as a powerful political tool. It can happen in every human society. There's a percentage of people who viscerally fear people who are different. But it's a sad shift to see them forgetting the lessons of the Howard era with respect to one nation. That generation of Conservative leaders understood instinctively, viscerally and intellectually that you cannot play footsie with one nation, the dangers of trying to play footsie with one nation. As Penny Wong said last week, I think, you can't out Pauline. We saw the visual example of that with the childish stunt. She didn't just get up in the morning and look in the wardrobe and go, oh, I wonder what I'll wear today. I'll get out my burqa. I haven't worn that for a while. It's just a deliberate tactic, frankly, to shit on groups of our fellow Australians to create outrage and anger. I wish it hadn't got the attention that it got, frankly. But the Labor Party knows this lesson with respect to the Greens political party. We know you cannot out-green the Greens, and don't ever try. They're populists, and in my view, not actors of good faith on many of these issues. Their political business model is as a party of protest, not a party of progress. It's very similar in that sense. I try to only do this once or twice a year on Twitter or whatever it's called now because of the level of outrage and head explosions, but it's a political business model that colonises a small part of the political spectrum and tends to try and create outrage and harvest those votes. In that sense, it's the same business model, different perspectives, different values, but it's the same political business model as One Nation. To try to accommodate them is to legitimise them. And many voters then conclude, why buy the light version? To his credit, the Shadow Minister, Senator Paul Scar, who's a good man, he's acknowledged that Australia does not suffer from mass migration. Not sure he's been allowed to say it recently, but he used to say it not that long ago. Despite this, many of his colleagues keep running around and spreading fear and nonsense. Now, it's a matter for them to explain, I won't dwell on this further, why today's Liberal Party keeps getting embroiled in these debates on race. None of this, of course, is to say we cannot or should not have a sensible policy debate on migration. We can and we should. Migration is core to our national identity, and the right settings are critical to our future economic security and success and national character. These are entirely legitimate questions, and there are reassurances that Australians are seeking about migration policy, both the levels and the composition. In the context of the competing policy tensions, and you understand them, an ageing population, the skilled labour shortages, housing, infrastructure and service pressures. Much of the current debate, though, is driven by a dishonest, opportunistic focus on net overseas migration in the 2 years after the borders reopened in an attempt to find a big, scary number. Now, I addressed the issue of NOM at length in the speech that I gave last month to the Migration Institute of Australia. It's an excellent speech. It's on the website if you want to refer to it. I'm not going to repeat it. There's a few people here. But in summary, as you know, NOM bounced along, then plummeted when the borders closed. I think it went negative for the first time since World War II. Then it spiked when they reopened in an entirely predictable fashion, and it's now down a bit over 40% and steadily returning to a more normal level. Oh, actually, the other way around, isn't it? There we go. But the Conservatives in their media cheer squad just focus on that narrow slice, divorced of all context, which is just frankly misleading. Of course, NOM is a metric to keep an eye on because of aggregate demand impacts, and it can be a lead indicator of pressure on the future program and so on. But it's a statistical concept, not a migration concept. Indeed, too often Australia's debate has focused only on the numbers, whichever headline number that might be out there. And frankly, if given an annual number, everyone in this room could design either a really excellent migration program that boosted the national economy and worked for Australians, or a really bad one that hurt the budget and hurt the labour market and hurt families. The point there is it's about quality, not just quantity. It's not just the size of the program, it's what you do with it that counts, if that cuts through to the public debate. That's why the government undertook the migration review, having inherited, frankly, a policy-free mess. And as I said, I worked for both sides of politics. Not every Liberal government was as bad as the previous term. There was genuinely little to no enforcement in the department. There was no discernible strategy. There was thousands of skilled public servants gone over those 9 years. And when I talk to the community, it's easy to go outside and burn something down. I wouldn't suggest we do it, but we could all go and burn down the building over there. But it takes a long time to rebuild. And the public service is the same. It's easy to sack people and lose capability, but it takes years to rebuild that capability, to train people in the truly dreadful IT systems which they have to work with. Cutting and pasting across 6 platforms on 2 screens, the legacy systems of decades ago. Security clear them and get them productive and to understand a very complex system. So in contrast, the government's now implementing the migration strategy and has rebuilt the department. We're not standing still though, as it's a dynamic environment and reform never stops, so stay tuned. But if they want to enter the debate, or anyone does, media commentators, the IPA, people want to enter the debate as adults, as the purported alternative of the government, or purported alternative government of the country in their case, then people need to do so, and the opposition needs to do so based on actual facts. If they or others want to argue for some magic mystery massive cut to migration, then they need to be specific on what precisely they would cut. Which visa classes? What would be the impact on the economy and Australians? Are they going to say to Australians, you can no longer fall in love with someone from overseas? Will they cut the partner visa program? They're going to say to rural Australians, like go to a lot of Tasmania and lots of regional Australia, you literally couldn't see the doctor. You couldn't go to an aged care home. You couldn't staff the hospital, of course, as people here know, without migration. They're going to say, we're going to smash our university sector. I mean, that bizarre culture war wrapped in a donor strategy masquerading as a policy, which was their international education policy at the last election. You know, the shadow minister, Senator Henderson, still out there pushing, cutting the percentage of international students, some bizarre unilateral benchmark of, I don't know, pick a number, they pick 25%. Literally billions of dollars lost in revenue to the G08 and most of our universities. Then they had the genius move to reallocate those places to the bottom end of the private vet sector. You literally couldn't make that up, but there you go. They need to be specific. That's their test. Now, given it in the limited time, I'll just make a few comments about a few of the specific matters that I'm responsible for under Tony Burke within the portfolio, and then should have a few minutes to take a couple of questions. On international student visas and the planning level, we have returned. We're seeing international student numbers returning to a more sustainable level. We've also started to put in place stronger links to housing. That is a social licence, and it is our fourth biggest export sector, but more than that, it's about human beings. It is the only sector that I know of, however, where every net aggregate gain, if you want to do widgets for a moment, requires a new house or a bedroom to live in. That's just a fact. And we've linked increasingly allocations for public universities to the construction of new student housing. It is working. There's 11,000 beds under construction, 15,000 approved, 12,000 in planning, and so on. Integrity reforms have been tough, and there's more to come. I hope the Senate passes the bill that's sitting in the Senate this week that was blocked by the Greens and the Libs before the last election. That'll give us additional powers, and particularly give ASQA, the regulator, additional powers to deal with the more egregious behaviour which we see at the bottom end of the sector. And I've recently released a new ministerial direction which includes 3 prioritisation levels now. Migration agents and Amara, I'll skip that, but happy to take questions. In essence, the regulations lapse next April. We're busy remaking them, and there's work that's underway that I touched on to the Migration Agents Conference. State and territory nominated skilled and regional migration in the role. States and territories are being given a greater say in shaping the migration program, and that's entirely sensible and appropriate. They often have better, more nuanced local and regional labour market data, but in particular, they have that lead responsibility under the Constitution for land use planning, for building, and for housing and infrastructure. So we're moving to state migration plans. We're moving to state and territory-led designated area migration agreements, and I recently signed off a few weeks ago the nomination allocations for the state and regional parts of the migration stream. Just to dispel an urban myth or two there, the number of visas to be granted this year under those programs haven't changed. We've reduced slightly the nominations that each jurisdiction can make to get supply and demand back into a better balance, in essence, to get waiting times down and return it to being a more agile economic development tool, as well as being fair to the human beings who are then waiting for a visa, paying international student fees, worried about Medicare, not able to get a home loan or buy a house and all that kind of basic human stuff. So I'm happy to talk about that. The final thing I just want to finish on this is the humanitarian program. The program's under enormous pressure. The number of displaced people in the world or those seeking resettlement is the highest since World War II. I think it's probably climbed over 100 million. I think the last figure I saw was over 85. But in the Australian context, the program is completely overwhelmed. We have massive oversubscription in the special humanitarian program. We are, I think, on the latest figures, the second most generous country at the moment in the UNHCR program, given the withdrawal of some others or the downsizing. The community-sponsored program, community support program is jammed, and we've suspended that a little while ago to work with the organisations to rebuild, and unfortunately a few of them chose to stop the pipeline. So there's over 20,000 people awaiting a decision in that part of the program, which is about an 8-year wait at the moment. We've maintained 20,000 humanitarian places this year, which I'm proud of, and it's generous, as well as sorting out the onshore temporary protection visa, Chev visa caseload, and reviewing a range of the other people who've been living in insecurity for far too long in our country. But the sector consultations raised some pretty complex and challenging policy issues. The prioritisation of vulnerable groups. The community experiences these things as delays and a lack of a timeline. Actually, it's a function of mathematics. Pretty much anyone can lodge an SHP, any Australian can sponsor anyone overseas. And there's very little demand management, which just leads to massive backlogs. It worries me that we employ so many very skilled, trained public servants to dutifully sit there and reject the vast majority of applications 8 or 10 years later. So we've had a range of suggestions about how we could adjust some of the program design. The abuse of the onshore protection visa system is an issue we're seeing right across the developed world with any country that chooses to operate within the Refugee Convention and the other relevant conventions. And we've had a lot of feedback from the refugee advocates and lawyers and that, with increasing frustration at this abuse because it prevents the department from finding and focusing on the most vulnerable people who need quick protection. You write to me a lot. For instance, always happy to read your letters. And the work which is now underway between all parts of the department to reflect on the alignment between the design of the humanitarian program and our settlement programs. There's a lot we could do there. So balancing compassion with integrity and sustainability remains a core challenge, and it is under pressure. So I've been reflecting and will continue to do so in the coming months with Ministers Burke and Ali on some of the fundamental program design questions to try and make sure that each stream of that program, putting aside the numbers, which change from year to year in relativities, but to make sure that each stream is coherent and makes sense. The UNHCR stream, the onshore protection stream, the SHP stream and the CSP stream, and a bit of the community-sponsored stuff that sits alongside. So happy to take a few questions before I have to run. Thanks very much, Alan.
Very kindly agreed to take some questions. Please keep them concise.
It's like speed questions.
Please keep them concise and with a question mark at the end. Who'd like to start?
Okay, great. Thanks.
Up here. Hello.
I'd like to get your view on how the state and territory governments could better strategically migration and how we could potentially work on migration advocacy and issues like the state as well.
Sure. There's a policy and a political dimension to that. I think the policy dimension is a lot of what we're already doing, but doubling down and embedding it and making it work. State migration plans, I'd say to each state jurisdiction, well, you set out your views about migration, make them intelligent, make them coherent, make them digestible for other government departments, for your infrastructure colleagues, for your housing colleagues, for your regional development colleagues, for labour market analysis and so on. The health department is a big user of your program, the education department, actually do the policy discipline of writing down a strategy or a plan. So that's the first thing. Some jurisdictions are a lot further advanced, others haven't yet started. Secondly, the move to state-led designated area migration agreements away from the sort of regional mishmash, we think makes sense because you bear the lead responsibility on the settlement issues in terms of infrastructure housing sense. Look, it's, had a bit of grief, but we've got there the nomination programs. There is always an affirmative action element to that for the smaller jurisdictions. I know Victoria, New South Wales, to a degree Queensland want more. They are an affirmative action program to some degree because Melbourne and Sydney and to a degree now Brisbane gets a much larger share, gets the lion's share of the general skilled migration program. We need those state nomination programs for Western Australia, for South Australia, for the Northern Territory, Tassie and so on. So just preempting the sort of letters which we'll continue to receive and always respond to politely, that's lovely. Look, the political dimension to that is when I talk with any state minister, everyone wants more. I can't think of a single state jurisdiction that isn't asking the Commonwealth for more skilled migrants, more international students or whatever. What they're really arguing for is a bigger migration program. But they kind of dress it up often in clever words. Our fair share of students, our fair share of skilled migrants, why don't you reduce your visa processing times? It's got to be linked to housing. You know, that is the challenge that I put back to all of the states and territories. You want to argue to the Commonwealth for faster visa processing times? No, be honest. What you're actually arguing for is a larger migration program. So if that's the argument you want to have, then we need to reflect on how that's linked to the housing performance, because it's real in aggregate and that's what the community expects.
Thanks so much. Let's round up a few questions. One. Others? That's there we go, and right behind as well. So let's get those one after another.
Thanks very much, Minister, for your very warm address. I'd like to ask about multi-year migration planning processes for state governments. That was started a couple of years ago, and then it went on pause. And I think that's a fantastic idea, and I'm just wondering if it's going to be picked up again.
By the way, folks, just indicate to me, you know, while the Assistant Minister's speaking or while questions are going, and I'll take note of your hand going up. That way we can get the mic to you quickly.
Yes, Graham Tom from the Refugee Council, and thank you, Minister, for talking about the humanitarian program and obviously wanting to acknowledge Australia's generosity in the humanitarian program. But one of the things we often bring to you is around the complementary pathways and how do we make private sponsorship additional to the program. We just had a good discussion, as you heard, around data and costings and how is that costing made. And I guess if we've got the population wanting to contribute to sponsoring refugees, how can we actually increase the size of the pie? And what would it take to make those places additional as per the Labor Party platform?
Do you want to grab two more and then I'll knock them on?
Okay, great. Two more questions. We've one here.
Just yell it out.
And then one over there. Great.
Oh, you've got people watching at home.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for that really well thought out and well presented speech. It's good to hear a minister who's across the portfolio, and I think also in touch with the department and the matters of concerns there, because in fact, you know, very clearly you did inherit a totally broken system, and it's taking some time to put it back together or even advanced.
Sorry to hurry you along.
Sorry, my question though is to go back to Graham's last question about the humanitarian program, and I'm concerned about the lack of focus, as I see it, on the reality of the situation of women and children in vulnerable positions. It's extremely hard to get any kind of leverage on people who are stuck in Pakistan and fleeing for their lives and now facing deportation. And we're talking young, educated girls being sent back.
Let me just address that. I'm not sure, in the interest of time, I can add much to the state migration thing from what I said earlier. I chaired the ministerial forum, well, feels like years ago, but a couple of months ago, I think, and there is a commitment to progressing the state migration plans. We've asked for feedback on the design of part 2 of those, but strongly encouraging in my most recent letters to the state ministers to move that work along in the way that I articulated earlier. Just on the humanitarian program, a little bit of context. If you look at what we've done over the first 3 years, it is incredibly generous. There's the formal humanitarian program. There's giving permanent protection to over 19,000 people on TPVs and SHEVs who've been stuck in our country in insecurity, visa zombies, frankly, wandering around, many of them living in my community. I'm proud of that. And they're now able to sponsor their families and in some cases meet children who they've never met from 10, 12 years ago. It's not an exaggeration. That is true for thousands of people, and be reunited with their own kids. We've also cleared out what was blatant discrimination with former Ministerial Direction 80 for long delayed partner visas, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, over 10 years, who are all now have been reunited with their kids. In many senses, those people are humanitarian migrants because of where they've been living and existing. So while they may come in other visa classes, the settlement issues in my parts of Melbourne, in other parts of Australia, are enormous. It's a very generous thing that we've done as a country in recent years and the right thing to do. And there's, of course, the fast track caseload, which we're reviewing, let alone the Ukrainian cohort, people from Israel, Gaza, and so on, fleeing that conflict with close family in Australia. So that is part of the context for considerations about the size of the formal humanitarian program. What I say to everyone on the complementary pathways, yeah, I get it. I was really proud to make Chris permanent and to announce that earlier in the year, around March. It'll be a permanent part of the program. But the additionality argument is cute, but we can't cheat. Treasury cost everything. What you're really arguing for, I get the additionality argument, and people have every right to argue that it is in the Labor Party's platform, is to grow the program over time. And it's not some magic thing where you go, oh, community sponsorship. Look, we invented 1,000 new people or whatever number you pick. The vast majority of the cost, the fiscal cost, sits in Medicare, it sits in Social Security, it sits in aged care, it sits in housing, it's aggregate demand. The settlement cost, whilst it has a whole range of benefits and it's a very generous thing that Australians do, the settlement costs are a very small proportion of the overall cost of bringing someone in. So, I'm a big supporter of that program, but the additionality argument is cute. It doesn't really stack up. It's just part of the program and it needs to be thought about. I accept some of the benefits, if you like, of making some of it a bit more demand-driven in terms of community support and buy-in. But yeah, so I made that point. We've got a lot of pressures on the program. There's a lot of pressures on it and, we're working through them. Just to finish on that point, over 300,000 people from Afghanistan applied post the fall of Kabul. My electorate has more people born in Afghanistan than any in the country. I live and breathe this. Unfortunately, the perception that we're slow on vulnerable women, it's simply not true. We have literally thousands of women at risk visas that have been moved into active processing in the queue. That's just a fact. And they are tough decisions. I have these conversations with people in my community all the time. I put it in writing, I don't hide from it. The average processing time, if you lodge a humanitarian visa today through the SHP, would be over 10 years. That's just a mathematical fact. The vast majority of them will be rejected. There's a legitimate question people have put to us about why we continue to allow people to sponsor their aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, cousins, business associates, people they met on the internet, people that the church met, friends, nice woman on the internet from Uganda, and chases around screaming at me about regularly. We can choose to do that, but we know the outcomes from the visa point of view. So all I'd say to the sector, and I had these discussions pretty direct way in the consultations, we need to try and grapple with these questions of demand management, supply.
Thank you, Mr. Numbers.
Yes. Well, I look at the numbers now, and the numbers are the numbers. Marion, put it in context. You talk about Iran and Pakistan. We continue to advocate for those people not to be deported to Afghanistan. And the Pakistani and Iranian government have millions of people in their society and they're making their judgments. We continue to advocate that. That is our position. Don't do that. Right? I can't stop that. We can't stop that. We tried and we continue to try. But there are over 70,000 close relatives of Australians alone in Pakistan and Iran. But most of those people cannot get a visa. There are other parts of the world that also have rightful demands on the program. UNHCR are rightly saying to us, we need to also look at the Asia Pacific. There's minority Christian communities in Syria and Iraq. Africa, you get it. But I just ask you all to keep it in context. Everyone comes in with their favourite thing. Vulnerable women at risk is a big part of the program and will continue to be, but there are multiple pressures on the program. I'm going to have to run because I really have to be there when the... Thank you very much.